Right, so next up, speaking about energy, we are certainly going to have a very energetic discussion because we are talking about the future of hydrogen. So we are going to be filling up on hydrogen as a Swiss Army knife of energy solutions. And for that, we will have a hybrid panel. Joining us online from Hamburg, we have Peter Lindlar, Managing Director of High Solutions. And joining us here on site, we have Aman Modi, Managing Director of Boston Consulting Group. Hi, Aman. And we have Taras Vankovic, Founder and CEO of H3 Dynamics. All right, Aman, you know, there's a lot of talk about sustainable and clean technologies or energy, thanks to Elon Musk and others. But we hear so much talk about battery cells, not so much about fuel cells, which really, if you think about it, a little surprising, considering hydrogen is the most abundant element in the universe, comprising 90% of all atoms. Based on your experience, what do you think are some of the challenges in adopting hydrogen?
Thank you first of all for that question. I think, look, when we think about hydrogen, first thing, a lot of people think hydrogen is a new thing. Hydrogen has been around for a very long time. In fact, Taras was just mentioning earlier that you've been working on hydrogen for 20 years. So it's actually quite an old technology. Where we need to find space for hydrogen is in the application. Is much more in the application space for hydrogen. There are some places, for example, like industrial use, where it is already a compelling use case. There are some places which are in development, such as derivatives of hydrogen, like e-ammonia in shipping as a shipping fuel. And there are yet others where still groundbreaking use cases, such as aviation, for example, and heavy transport. So when I think about the challenges, for me, I would just break this down into three categories. There is a technology element to it, there is a commercial element to it, and then there is a regulation element to it. As I said, for some of these areas, technology still needs to be developed. For example, hydrogen does not travel as well as some of the other fuels that we use today. So developing the conversion and reconversion pathways, such as ammonia, for example. Second, making it financially attractive, comparable to the other sources of energy that we have today. And third, having the right supporting policies, ambitions attached with it. And this is where I think, some countries in Asia, I feel, are leading the way, such as Japan and Korea, making a big play of hydrogen as a primary means of achieving net zero and energy transition. But we need to have a more supportive policy ecosystem in place to really see hydrogen reach its potential.
So we've talked more about the challenges in terms of adoption and what needs to be done, such as technological shifts, even governmental support. What about in terms of production and distribution? What are the challenges and how can we overcome those?
So I think from a production point of view, if we think about green hydrogen, one of the biggest constraints, there's two main constraints. Number one is the availability of renewable energy. While we have a lot of renewable energy potentially, the first use case for renewable energy, renewable power, is going to be replacing the conventional power for the conventional uses. And we are starting to already get into a space where things like land permits for renewable power are starting to get scarce. That being said, there are places in the world where we have abundant supply of these things, such as the desert in Australia or Saudi Arabia, which is why we see a lot of mega hydrogen projects being announced in those places. The tricky part from there is when you produce something in the desert of Saudi Arabia or in Australia, how do you transport it to a source of demand? And that's where I think there is a bit of a leap in technology for hydrogen that needs to be made. Either, for example, liquefying it like we did with natural gas several years ago, but there are challenges. Gas liquefies at minus 70 degrees to 110 degrees, whereas hydrogen is more than 2x of that. So, how do we make that liquefaction, make it denser to make it easier to transport, or use pathways such as ammonia or toluene? And the challenge there today is converting hydrogen to ammonia is easy. Reconverting it back to hydrogen is much more expensive. So I think those are the few breakthroughs that need to be made in order to make it much easier, more economically viable to not only produce but also transport hydrogen.
Certainly. Thank you, Aman. And speaking of production, distribution, and eventually adoption and how we bring it all together, I wanted to first, let's go back to Peter, and then Taras will talk about hydrogen aviation later. Now, Peter, we know that Hamburg is a pioneer in this area with, again, more than 60 green hydrogen projects already under your belt. Could you walk us through some of those key hydrogen industrialization projects, production as well as use cases, and what can we look forward to seeing even in the near future?
Yeah, good afternoon from Hamburg. I'm Peter Lindlar here calling from Hamburg, and sorry for some technical problems. So let me start with the brief introduction. What is the portfolio of Hamburg activities? We are a public-private partnership organization. We conduct most of these projects, and it's all along the value chain, starting with production, with distribution, the storage of hydrogen, and a number of applications which are not just mobility, but also industrial use, as is said already. When it comes to mobility, we have to consider that this is not just street traffic, and we have all the range from vehicles, trains to ship to aviation sector. And Hamburg is home of Airbus Industries, so we are a location where aviation plays a key role. And the new generation, the next generation of planes will be fueled by liquid hydrogen, and they will have their market entry in 2035. So the roadmap in the aviation sector is one of the key things where we have to focus on. But also the maritime applications and the role of the ship industry when it comes to hydrogen transport. As we know, and it is said already, that we have a real challenge in providing renewable energy, in that scaling up of electrolyzers when it comes to domestic production. So we have to import, and the shipping industry has a key role in the import as long as it is not a pipeline bound. And this will take a while with the European grid and the so-called backbone projects. And the project portfolio is buses, is taxis, taxi cabs. It's also a lot of industrial use in steel industry, copper, aluminium, and so on.
So certainly a lot of progress in terms of using green hydrogen in maritime, in ports, powering public transports like buses and eventually aviation, which we will get to. Can you share with us a bit more about how the High Five Hydrogen Alliance of the 5 northern states in Germany are specifically working together on some of these projects?
Yes, for example, when we look at the port situation, which is so important for the import of green hydrogen, or even ammonia or other derivatives, we have an understanding not to have a competition between each other, but to have a complementary concept where we have lead partnerships that are split in the northern part of Germany. And within these lead partnerships, we take responsibility for different projects. But in the overall coherent strategy, we have common targets and common issues, and the strategy, which is the basics of all the activities, was already launched in 2019, so before the pandemic came, and therefore we have some kind of maturity within our project.
Right. And just finally, since you touched on partnerships and importing energy, we know that while we wait for the supply of hydrogen to catch up, there are plenty of industries that want to use hydrogen already. So again, in closing that gap, we know Germany is importing from other countries. Can you tell us a bit more about who these other countries are and how extensive these partnerships are at the moment?
Yeah, there are there are a lot of activities in the Middle East region, in South America. Countries like Chile are important for European market. So there will be some developments that will see within the next years, which are very, very interesting. And the key question is how to handle ammonia and how to handle liquid hydrogen. Also, the challenges for the port authorities and the port administrations, and to have the concepts and make it feasible.
Right. Thank you so much for sharing that, Peter. Again, very forward-thinking initiatives by Hamburg and the 5 northern states and across Germany as well. Now, coming back to something that all 3 speakers have touched upon so far, and that is the future of hydrogen aviation. Now, Taras, you have been a pioneer in hydrogen for the last 20 years. In fact, you sold your first fuel cell company in 2003.
I started it.
You started it
yeah,
way
actually,
before many of us were talking about hydrogen.
And I have witnesses in this room actually that were there when I started the company. So
go back a long way.
Very interesting to see these familiar faces, right? And so the first company I started in 2003, where we were agnostic in terms of both the technology and the application. We kind of free to move wherever we wanted in terms of the direction, and we kind of followed the flow. We did start in Shanghai in China, so I spent about 8 years in Shanghai, and Kelvin Tai here in the room, who was at the EDB antenna in Shanghai, invited us actually to incorporate in Singapore, and that's the reason why I'm here right now, actually, so 20 years later.
And you've certainly come a long way, and actually now your new project is in making hydrogen aviation a reality.
Aviation actually started back in 2006 for us, by accident, because we were not really looking at aviation specifically. In fact, in the beginning, I always carry with me my first ever product, which ended up in science education applications all over the world. We sold close to 1 million of these little fuel cells, and nobody took us very seriously, but we evolved from this time to 350 kilowatt single modules, and we became in 2021 the #1 fuel cell manufacturer in China. So from this to very big systems to #1 market share in China. Okay, Kelvin, that's an interesting situation. And then from there, we spun off a hydrogen heavy vehicle company called Hyzon Motors, which is listed on NASDAQ, which raised $600 million about 2 years ago, and it's going full on in Europe and in US. In fact, we just announced a partnership with DB Schenker in Germany, which has established the first hydrogen truck line, commercial line over there. And the aviation side originated in 2006 with NASA, where they kind of asked us to develop a specific solution for them, and we flew a first experimental aircraft in the California desert back in 2006. And we didn't know anything about this whole area. We discovered it as we went along. We did this incredible flight in Germany with a DLR in 2007. In fact, I just came back from Hamburg. So Peter, we have yet to meet, but we are working with ZAL Aerospace Institute. We are part of the Lufthansa Cleantech Hub. We work with Lufthansa Technik, so on and so forth. Our strategy is the same in aviation as it was in the ground mobility side. The strategy is to think big, which is complicated with hydrogen because of infrastructure challenges, so on and so forth, but to start tiny, okay? And for us, tiny in aviation, it's drones. So in fact, from the moment we started in 2006, and even today, we are active in applying hydrogen to elongate the flight duration of electric drones. And the applications are mostly defense and security. So we started a company in Texas, which is only doing that. But we are using the learnings in unmanned systems and elongation of flight duration to scale it up into aviation. And we have developed technology. We have now a branch in Toulouse in the Airbus backyard ecosystem, where we are developing propulsion systems, let's say self-contained propulsion nacelles, which are now funded by the Toulouse region.
Right.
And it's going to be a very long road to bring this technology to aircraft, but the starting point for us might not be onboard power. It could be external to the aircraft, because aircraft use power in different ways, right? And so we're pragmatic about it. What are all the ways that an aircraft uses power? And one way is external power, ground power supply, when it's stationary on the ground. So there is an application, it's used every day in Changi Airport. There's about 117 gates at the airport. Every one of them has a diesel generator which connects to the aircraft, right, to power it during overhaul. And there's 8 overhauls a day on 117 gates. That's a lot of diesel being burned at Changi Airport. So we think that one of the first applications to decarbonize aviation is simply by replacing those diesel generators, and then gradually moving into the aircraft, because the barrier is not so much the technology, the barrier is the certification. And this is where it can be very costly and will take a very long time to get there.
Absolutely, especially infrastructure as well, waiting for it to catch up. Actually, on this front, so far we've been talking a lot about green hydrogen, and as Taras said, by his own was experimented even with hydrogen flight back in 2006, so it's almost 20 years. So clearly the runway, it takes a bit of time. So Aman, I wanted to come back to you actually. Right now, the reality is when it comes to hydrogen, 90% or more is gray and blue hydrogen. How do we move away from gray and blue towards green hydrogen being a reality?
I mean, the first thing I would say is that, look, blue, let's not disregard blue hydrogen. I think it's an interesting and meaningful stepping stone to getting to green. So that would be the first thing I would say. That being said, green is indeed the future. Green is the more sustainable, the real sort of zero emission fuel, or as close as we can get to it, that is out there. And I would just go back to the same things that I mentioned earlier, right, which is around technology, regulation, and commerciality. But if we see the question really is, where do you start? And for something which is new, my view is that the governments, the regulators will need to start by giving it a push. This is not going to automatically become commercially viable without that push. And that means having supportive policy in place, depending on your own context, making hydrogen a key part of your decarbonization pathways like Japan and Korea have done. It includes investing in research and development for high priority, high value, high impact use cases. It involves subsidies for infrastructure development that we have talked about, as well as direct user incentives that we can see. And we need to in some ways look no further than the US, where they have announced a raft of incentives under the Inflation Reduction Act, which makes hydrogen that much more commercially viable. And fundamentally, I think we need to break down the commercial barrier if we need to make this usable at scale. Alongside all the other safety regulations and so on and so forth we need to put in place. But I'm actually more confident of technology getting there than the regulatory and policy support being there, keeping up the pace at the same time.
So we absolutely need more of a push to make it viable, and then it reaches a tipping point for actual adoption. I actually wanted to give the opportunity. It's very rare that we get to talk about hydrogen, especially with such an esteemed panel. So I would like to throw the floor open. Questions from online and in person. Any questions for Peter, for Aman, for Taras? Well, if not, I think some of our speakers want to chime in on what has already been said. Peter first, and then we'll come back to Taras.
Mhm.
Again,
Yeah, I just want to refer to
please
what
add your
Aman
thoughts.
just said about the color of hydrogen. This is not the main challenge. The main challenge really is to establish the infrastructure for hydrogen transport. And the infrastructure doesn't care about the color of hydrogen. I think we, of course, as already mentioned, we have a bottleneck in the availability of renewable energies, but we will overcome this within the next few years. So what we have to do now is to speed up with installing the infrastructure, the transport infrastructure. And the main challenge that we face is the diversification of different types of derivatives, liquid hydrogen, compressed hydrogen. For example, back to the aviation sector, they focus on liquid hydrogen. The heavy-duty vehicles, part of the industry focuses on liquid hydrogen, the other part on compressed hydrogen. So we have to be more or less flexible with all the infrastructure concepts. And this will be one of the key challenges that we face.
Absolutely. So government legislation, subsidies to bring forth the infrastructure to then accelerate adoption. Taras, what
And
other...
let me just, sorry. Let me just, one more word on certification. As certification has been mentioned already, this is really important. And what we do in Hamburg here, we will establish a new test center where we do all the certification procedures, and it's mainly focusing on the supply chain, not on the big OEMs, but on the suppliers, on the component sector, and so on. So we go much more into detail than we ever did.
Absolutely. For hydrogen to succeed, not only infrastructure has to be in place, but really the entire supply chain, like you said, Peter. Any questions from the floor, please, before I go back to Taras? We have a question from the back, and then perhaps Taras, you can add on in response to that.
Yeah, thanks so much for this. I just have a quick question. So I think Taras mentioned that in the aviation sector in Changi Airport, there's a lot of diesel gensets that can be potentially replaced by hydrogen. Are there any other sectors that you see beyond aviation that maybe has a huge number of diesel gensets that maybe hydrogen can be a potential fuel replacement?
Construction. So there, obviously diesel gensets are an interesting application as long as the cost can be competitive between the diesel and the hydrogen. But we've learned through the trucking experience that the economic models work on cost comparison, not necessarily on CapEx, but now Goldbell might be interested in this, on the OpEx, because the total cost of ownership is where hydrogen has an advantage. So if we go to a leasing model of the genset or the truck or whatever it is, suddenly we are able to make things work economically. If you try to buy things, from the off the shelf, the capex might be a little bit higher with hydrogen in the beginning. So the way to go around it is to work with the OpEx model. Going back to the infrastructure challenge, honestly, if I had to wait for infrastructure to happen for 20 years, I would have, gone bankrupt 20 times already, right? So I did not wait for that, and there are ways around it. Okay, and the conversation we're having today is the same one we've been having for, I think, 20 years, okay, when it comes to the hydrogen topic or the infrastructure topic, et cetera, and the government, support. We never relied on government support to actually make things work, even economically, because as entrepreneurs, you can only really rely on yourself. right? And if I had to rely on a big gas company to establish a hydrogen infrastructure, I would have never sold any of my products. So we have to build the applications where it makes sense. Where it makes sense for hydrogen is not what we might have thought about 20 years ago, or even 10 years ago, or maybe even today. Commercial B2B applications are where it makes sense, not consumer applications. So in the beginning, we thought about passenger cars. There was this whole wave with Toyota and Honda and everybody else, still going on, kind of. But the real market fit is with commercial vehicles. Commercial vehicles, why? Because they have a back-to-base, point-to-point type operation, which is repetitive. Forklift trucks, very good application. Amazon is big on hydrogen forklift trucks in their warehousing operations. Good example. Trucks, point-to-point operations, repetitive, warehouse to port, port to warehouse, warehouse to port, every single day, constantly the same route. It's not multiple routes. So you only need 2 points of refueling, not hundreds or thousands, which is what the infrastructure barrier typically says. EVs are much more, it's easier for cars to go on an EV charging basis. So to each technology and each application, the right fit, and this is what I think we've learned mostly over the 20 years. In aviation, same thing. You're talking about point to point. An airport becomes a hub, right? And that's the only place where you need the hydrogen. You need the hydrogen all over the place. You just need it at the airport. One airport, maybe 2 airports, and suddenly you have one route. And that's all you need to start.
That certainly makes it a lot more viable, even from an infrastructural point of view, like Aman was highlighting.
Can I add on to
Yes,
this? I think
please.
I love this point, by the way. I think that when we look at all the net zero projections across the world, what we will see is that the last 60% of net zero challenge is addressed by carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, and hydrogen. So the world demands to be net zero a massive contribution from blue and green hydrogen. And while I agree with you that for specific solutions we will be able to find economic models that work, and indeed the ones that you highlight are exactly the right ones. For hydrogen to contribute 40% of the world's net zero carbon emission or decarbonization demands, the applications that we require will be much more widespread than those specific ones. And if we want to get there, that's where we need that infrastructure push. But on the flip side, indeed, for some of those we have that 20-25 years rather than having to do it now.
You need a starting point. On the hydrogen color issue, if I may, right? I'm excited about new technologies coming for hydrogen production. And hydrogen, the wonder about hydrogen is that it can be made in different ways. Everybody thinks about electrolysis as the natural, only way of making hydrogen, but it's not the only way. Electrolysis, obviously, can use solar, can use wind, and depending on where you are in the world, you either have a lot of wind or you don't. I mean, it would make sense to put wind turbines or wind-powered hydrogen in Singapore, for example. However, it makes sense to do that in northern Germany, right, which is already powered by wind power, right? In the northwest of the United States, same thing. Solar in Australia or Middle East, okay, but that's for electrolysis, and frankly, electrolysis is not the most energy, let's say, efficient method. You lose energy when you make hydrogen using electrolysis. In fact, you lose up to 50% of the original energy. So you should be using only excess energy you don't know what to do with, to make hydrogen, and the rest should go into the grid. So these kind of learnings. And then there are other ways that I'm excited about, which are emerging. One is using municipal waste as a feedstock for hydrogen production. No CO2 emissions, no burning. In some countries, we have plenty of waste, but not enough water. If you're using electrolysis, you need pure water to make hydrogen. You need this. And this should be reserved for drinking, not for making hydrogen. So if we could look at those new technologies using waste countries like Singapore, India, where water is a precious resource, I believe that there's a future for waste to hydrogen generation. So we're talking about those kind of approaches as well in my company.
Wonderful, absolutely visionary. I think we have time for probably just one last question, if anybody wants to ask it from the floor. Yes, please. One very brief question, please.
Just a quick one. You said that you lose 50% of the energy when you employ electrolysis to create hydrogen. What does that mean?
The process by which you need electricity to split the water, right? And the efficiency of this process, the amount of hydrogen I produce from this electricity input, I have a 50% loss. Okay. So
Also,
in my
the energy content
energy
of the
loss,
hydrogen
yeah.
is 50% that of what you put.
That's
Okay.
right.
And
There's some new technologies that improve that efficiency, but there's still a loss.
And for waste to hydrogen, are you talking about things like gasification of the waste to create the hydrogen?
Well, we through a sister company, we invested together with Chevron in a company called Raven SR. And this company is basically using a Fischer-Tropsch process, okay, to basically, they can actually produce SAF as a first stage and hydrogen as a second stage, which makes it kind of ideal for aviation use. So we've been looking at that for airport implementation.
Sorry, what's SAF?
Certainly.
Sustainable aviation fuels.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, I think that was a very interesting discussion. I wish we had another 20 more minutes at least. But certainly we have learned a lot that the color of hydrogen matters. Let's not bash the intermediary steps to get there, about focusing on the commercial B2B fit, about viability, infrastructure being a really key part, and government support. Definitely helpful.
Thank you.
With that, thank you so much. Please join me in thanking Aman, Taras, and Peter, who's joining us online. So once again, thank you. And do check them out and the work that they do on hydrogen.
Thank you.
Thank you once again.